The year was 1762, and Finch Manor stood like a dark jewel among the rolling hills of Norfolk, its windows reflecting the dying sun as though the house itself hoarded secrets behind the glass. Inside its halls, the Finch family lived with the rigid dignity expected of nobility. Their name whispered in reverence at court, and their wealth tied to both land and loyalty to the crown. Lord Alistair Finch carried himself as a man of discipline, a noble who valued precision above warmth, a man who believed that appearances were not merely important but sacred. To his peers he was respected, even admired. To his household he was a figure to be feared, his rules enforced with the quiet severity of law carved into stone. His twin sons, born on a rain-swept night in April, were presented to the world as symbols of providence, two boys who would one day carry the Finch line forward in strength and unity. For 8 years they attended feasts, seen by candlelight at the long oak tables, their identical faces the subject of fascination for guests who whispered of fortune and blessing. Yet those who looked closely noticed the father's eyes rarely softened when they lingered on the children. Instead, there was an unease, a private tension, as though the existence of two heirs disturbed rather than delighted him. As the boys grew, their innocence became something Alistair studied like a physician observing a specimen. They laughed in the gardens, dressed in matching coats of crimson, their steps in rhythm as if guided by a bond no one else could hear. To their mother, Lady Margaret, they were a gift of grace. To their father, they were a riddle he was determined to solve. Alistair's obsession was whispered about in the servants' quarters, his late nights spent with anatomical texts, his fascination with symmetry and imbalance, his conviction that perfection of bloodlines required the elimination of weakness. In an era when medicine was tangled with superstition and ritual, Alistair blended science with belief, turning what should have been paternal love into an experiment he could not abandon. By their 8th year, the twins became less visible. At first, it was excused as illness. The family announced that the boys had taken a fever, that rest was needed. Guests stopped asking after them when polite nods and strained smiles dismissed further questions. In truth, it was not illness that kept them hidden, but a decision, a silence crafted by Alistair himself. He had concluded that the twins represented an error, a doubling of identity that offended nature. One heir should exist, not two. One name should carry forward, not a fractured echo. He told himself he was preserving the family's strength, but beneath the words was something darker, a fascination with control, with shaping life itself, with holding the power to erase a child, as though erasing a mistake in ink. The silence spread through the manor like rot. The boys' laughter vanished from the gardens. Their footsteps no longer echoed down the corridors. Servants who once buttoned their coats or brushed their hair were reassigned and warned not to ask why. When one maid dared to mention them in Lady Margaret's presence, she was dismissed without reference, cast into poverty for speaking what was no longer permitted. In households of nobility, reputation was everything, and silence was often its strongest guard. Alistair wielded silence like a blade, cutting away questions before they could form. Neighbors noticed. For years the twins had been a spectacle, their mirrored appearances a point of curiosity. When they ceased to appear, whispers began. Some believed they had died of plague or scarlet fever, as so many children of the age did. Others murmured of madness in the Finch line, recalling distant relatives who had fallen into lunacy, hinting that the boys may have been afflicted and hidden to preserve dignity. The truth was darker than either guess, but it was buried under layers of propriety and fear. No one dared confront Lord Finch directly, for his influence stretched far, and those who opposed him often found their fortunes diminished or their names tarnished in court. Behind the closed doors of Finch Manor, Alistair's fixation deepened. The twins, stripped of their place in the outside world, became subjects in his private doctrine. He recorded their behavior with meticulous care, noting their gestures, their reactions to separation, the subtle ways their bond frayed when torn apart. What others would have seen as cruelty, he justified as discipline, convinced he was uncovering truths no physician of the crown could grasp. To his mind, he was not a monster, but a pioneer, a man strong enough to do what others feared, to cleanse, to correct, to perfect. Thus began the silence that would define the Finch twins' lives. At public gatherings, they ceased to exist, their names unspoken, their portraits quietly removed from the manor's gallery. The family line was spoken of as though it bore a single heir, not two. To society, they were ghosts of children who had succumbed to sickness. But within the manor walls, they were something else entirely. Captives of a father's obsession, swallowed by the darkness of a doctrine that no one dared challenge. What the world saw as tragedy, Lord Finch saw as necessity. And beneath his calm, noble exterior, a macabre hunger stirred, one that would only grow as silence gave way to something far worse. In the months after the twins were withdrawn from sight, Lord Alistair Finch transformed his library into a shrine where cruelty dressed itself as science. And each night he convinced himself that fatherhood demanded a higher duty than warmth, that to love his sons meant to perfect them by force if nature had failed to do so. He collected scraps of knowledge the way other men collected relics, bribing carriers to bring him drawings copied from William Hunter's secret studies on anatomy, pages that showed how twins formed in the womb before breaking apart, lines of veins that curved like rivers split in two, and to Alistair these were not drawings but warnings that duplication was corruption. He obtained private notes whispered to be written by physicians of King George III, pages that spoke of humors, of storms in the mind, of how order could be restored by strict regimen. And he treated these as commandments from a higher throne, proof that even the crown's healers recognized the danger of excess in the body and the spirit. Out of these fragments he carved his doctrine, naming it the Rule of One, a law so simple and cold that it disguised its horror. A house must have a single heir, a bloodline a single voice, and if nature faltered, then man as guardian must correct her error. He pressed the words into a calfskin journal, annotating Hunter's diagrams with his own neat script, bending treatments into rituals, turning medical cures into sacred acts, and where the physicians had written of soothing the brain, he wrote of silencing. Where they had suggested balancing humors, he recorded instructions for draining, and each entry hardened his resolve. To test his ideas, he began with small trials, keeping hares and doves in mirrored cages so they fought their own reflections until one lay broken, and he wrote that the weaker vision always collapsed, as if nature itself chose a victor. He lit paired candles carved from the same tallow and timed which flame surrendered first, calling the survivor the true light, and these crude demonstrations became sermons in his mind, sermons that confirmed the necessity of division until only one remained. Soon his doctrine demanded blood, and he began with those whose lives were already frayed. A tenant who had fallen behind in rent was offered forgiveness if he submitted to a study of rest, and the man was placed in a soundless box lined with waxed cloth, his breath shallow in the dark while Alistair timed each minute until silence became final. And he wrote that the mind without sound unraveled in 3 days. A scullery maid struck with winter fever was given a draught of vinegar and metal salts which tore her insides raw until her body seized. And he marked in his ledger that sweetness lingered on her tongue near the end, a sign that blood had yielded. These deaths did not register to him as crimes but as proofs, necessary bridges that justified the book he wrote in his clean hand. And he signed their names not in ink but as numbers in columns, erasing humanity as though it were a distraction. Outwardly he was tender, speaking softly at meals, offering charity to villages in winter, bowing in church with the calm of a pious lord, and it was this mask that allowed his doctrine to fester unseen. For none would suspect the hand that fed them also measured lives against the ticking of a watch. In solitude he designed mirrored chambers for children to be separated and tricked into, believing their echoes were brothers. And he charted diets that would starve one body while forcing the other to glut itself, imagining the imbalance would reveal which soul deserved to live. He wrote liturgies for blood, envisioning one child drained into silver chalices while the other drank, describing it not as cruelty but as a merging of strength, and he believed these plans were merciful acts of correction, sacred as baptism, precise as scripture. The terrible truth was that he felt peace as he drafted each page, sleeping better than he had in years, confident that the rule of one was no longer an idea but a destiny. And upstairs the twins waited as pawns in a doctrine they could not yet comprehend. 2 lives already written as one in their father's ruthless design. By their 9th year the Finch twins had vanished not into graves but into the bowels of the manor, hidden in rooms that no guest would ever see. Finch Manor's underbelly was a labyrinth of stone chambers meant once for storage and servants, but under Lord Alistair's hand it became a theater of silence and suffering. He led the boys down stairwells that smelled of earth and mildew, past doors bolted shut until they reached a narrow corridor where light died completely. Here he built his chambers, 2 identical cells facing each other, their walls lined with polished steel panels that reflected the dim lantern glow, until it seemed the boys stood surrounded by shifting copies of themselves. Yet they could not see one another, for the chambers were sealed with thick wooden doors. They were allowed only to hear, and what they heard was never true. Inside those chambers, Alistair devised his ritual of division. Each boy spoke, and his voice was carried through a hidden pipe, warped and delayed, until it reached the other as a distorted echo. The words came broken, stretched, unnatural, until the twins began to believe they were listening to strangers, not brothers. The ritual was simple in its cruelty, but devastating in its effect. Hours became days, the boys' laughter replaced by sobs, then by silence as they realized they could no longer trust the sound of their own voices. Alistair called it dividing the soul, recording every moment in his calfskin journal as if he were describing the growth of crops. To him it was not torment but progress, proof that the bond between the twins could be torn and reshaped by force. The first deaths that followed were not theirs but belonged to the animals he used to refine his method. Birds placed in mirrored cages beat themselves bloody against the reflections, convinced there was no escape. A stray boy from the village, lured by the promise of coin, was locked in one of the chambers for 3 nights. When Alistair opened the door, the child had clawed at his own face, fingernails ripped down to bone, convinced that the whispers he heard were demons mocking him. The boy died of shock before dawn, and his body was buried in the orchard, a nameless offering to the experiment. The twins were told nothing, though they felt the cold absence in the air, the way the walls seemed to breathe when the chambers sealed behind them. Alistair believed children were clay, pliable and eager to survive. He stripped the boys of toys, books, and comfort, leaving only their voices and the haunting echoes that fractured them further each night. He would observe through a slit, his eyes steady as one twin screamed for the other, and the response arrived delayed, bent by pipes, so that the plea for help became mockery. The more they cried, the more convinced they became that the voice they once trusted was betraying them. They began to despise each other, to curse the sound of their twin, believing the other had turned into a cruel stranger. In that hatred, Alistair saw what he called separation of essence. He wrote with calm precision that innocence must be broken to reveal truth. And he believed the truth was that only one of them was real. The toll was immediate. Their eyes dulled, their bodies shook with exhaustion. Their small hands trembled even when given food. Sleep brought no rest, for in dreams they heard the distorted voices replaying, haunting them like a second consciousness that would not leave. The twins, once inseparable, now sat apart, even when permitted in the same chamber. Their bond, their only refuge, had been methodically broken by their father's hand, and Alistair considered this a victory worth more than any inheritance of land or coin. As weeks passed, the chambers became their world, and the manor above forgot their footsteps. Guests spoke of a single Finch heir, and servants lowered their heads in fear whenever the boys were mentioned. Silence had consumed their place in society, and now silence consumed their minds. Alistair was certain he had proven his doctrine, that the soul could be split, that twins were not a blessing but a corruption, and that his hand alone could shape which one would remain. The first experiment was not the end, but only the beginning of a cruelty that would deepen with every year the twins remained in the bowels of Finch Manor. By their 11th year, the Finch twins no longer resembled the carefree children who once ran across the gardens. Their lives were reduced to ritual, each day dictated by their father's conviction that symmetry was a lie and imbalance the key to truth. Lord Alistair had grown fascinated by accounts from Europe of physicians who starved the poor during times of famine to record the body's collapse, experiments whispered about in the courts of France and Austria, as if they were glimpses into divine secrets. To him, famine was not tragedy but opportunity, and within his own house he designed a study more cruel than any whispered in foreign halls. He declared that one twin must be the vessel of hunger, while the other would become the vessel of excess. Only by forcing the body to extremes could he reveal which soul deserved to remain. At first, the cruelty took the shape of meals. One boy was seated before a plate stripped bare, given only a cup of water and a crust of bread too stale to chew. The other was forced to consume dish after dish, meat heavy with grease, puddings rich with sugar and lard, bowls of milk until his stomach swelled against his ribs. Alistair sat at the head of the table, recording each bite, noting how one son trembled with longing while the other gagged through mouthfuls that sickened him. The cries of hunger and the retching of fullness became a symphony to his ears, proof that balance was weakness and extremity a revelation. Weeks turned into months, and the twins' bodies began to betray them. The starved boy's skin clung to his bones, his cheeks hollow, his eyes sunken yet burning with a sharpness that refused to die. His brother, swollen and sluggish, moved with the heavy breaths of a man 3 times his age, his stomach raw from constant strain, his veins slow with sugar and fat. Alistair watched both with the cold patience of a physician, proud that their suffering bore marks he could measure. He weighed them daily, charting numbers in neat columns, sketching their skeletal outlines against the pages of his doctrine. He wrote of hunger sharpening the mind and gluttony revealing the weakness of indulgence, never once acknowledging that both were children stripped of choice, their innocence devoured by his obsession. But Alistair's doctrine demanded more than simple feeding. He began withholding water from the starved boy, measuring how many hours passed before delirium set in. He forced the overfed child to swallow oils and salted meats until his lips cracked with thirst, then denied him relief until he vomited on the stone floor. The waste was gathered, noted, and cleaned away with a precision that made the cruelty seem like ritual rather than chaos. Servants who dared to look away or whisper were dismissed, and those who obeyed learned to serve the meals with eyes downcast, knowing that pity itself was a crime in Finch Manor. The first death came from outside the family. A stable hand caught stealing oats during a harsh winter was given over to Alistair's doctrine as punishment. For 7 days he was locked in a cellar with only water, his body shrinking until he staggered against the walls, his breath rattling like dry leaves. Alistair recorded his final moments, noting that hunger did not break the body first but the mind, that the man began to speak to shadows before collapsing. The death was written into his ledger not as a crime but as evidence, a page marked with diagrams of ribs and notes on pulse. To Alistair, the stable hand was nothing more than another test, a nameless body that made the twins' suffering seem justified by comparison. The boys endured, but endurance was no victory. The starved twin grew haunted, whispering to himself as though speaking might fill the emptiness inside. The overfed brother lived in constant shame, vomiting behind closed doors yet forced to eat again until the act itself felt like torture. They no longer looked at each other with the affection of brothers. Instead, each grew to resent the other's suffering, believing it unfair that one should starve while the other drowned in food. Alistair fed on this resentment as much as he fed them, writing that division had become visible, that the soul of one must rise and the other must fall. The hunger of symmetry left its mark on them forever. Their bodies twisted under the weight of cruelty, their spirits drained into numbers on parchment, their cries absorbed by stone walls that remembered everything. Alistair, sitting in the candlelit dark with his journal open before him, believed he was closer than ever to perfection. He did not see two broken children. He saw proof that imbalance would reveal destiny. And in his mind, the next stage demanded even greater sacrifice. By their 12th year, the Finch twins had been remade into shadows of children, their innocence stripped away by silence and imbalance, their bond now a wound that refused to heal. Lord Alistair, however, was far from finished. To him, the soul was no longer merely divided, it was raw material waiting to be purified by ritual. His eyes had turned toward blood, the fluid that all physicians of the age considered the keeper of health, but which he regarded as the scripture of lineage itself. He pored over accounts of medieval transfusion experiments, crude stories of animals stitched together by veins, and he dwelled on whispers from the French court of Louis XV, where it was said that noblemen had toyed with the exchange of fluids as a cure for melancholy. He twisted those tales into doctrine, writing that blood was the true mirror of the soul and that for one heir to be perfected, his essence must be poured into the body of the other. The cellar chambers of Finch Manor became his church. At dusk, Alistair lit tall wax candles and placed silver chalices upon a stone altar, their surfaces polished so that they reflected trembling flames. The twins were brought in barefoot, their faces pale under the flickering light, their bodies carrying the scars of hunger and excess. He positioned them opposite one another, one to give, the other to receive. With tools stolen from surgical kits, fine knives and hollow tubes, he cut carefully into the veins of the chosen twin. Blood slipped from the wound in a slow, steady stream, filling the chalice with dark warmth. The child's body weakened quickly, his lips drained of color, his small hands twitching as though reaching for something unseen. His brother, trembling, was then forced to drink, gagging against the metallic taste, his stomach twisting as warm life slid down his throat. Alistair watched without pity, his gaze steady, his journal open to record pulse, color, reaction. This ritual he named the Mirror of Blood, believing it would merge their divided essences into one. Each ceremony was carried out with the calm pacing of a priest at Mass. The bleeding was not quick but measured, a flow timed by sand glass. The drinking was not optional but commanded, each swallow forced until the child retched, then forced again until the chalice was emptied. In Alistair's eyes, what others would call horror was purification, the removal of waste from one vessel and the strengthening of another. He believed the family line would emerge from these rituals as sharper than steel, cleansed of nature's error. The toll on the boys was catastrophic. The one chosen to bleed grew weaker each time, his skin pale and his heart racing even at rest. He fainted often, waking in confusion, his body trembling as though it belonged to someone else. His brother, made to drink, became sickly in a different way. His stomach knotted, his sleep filled with vomiting and fever. They began to look at one another with haunted fear, each seeing in the other's suffering a reflection of his own. What once had been the comfort of sameness had turned into terror, for they no longer knew whether they were themselves or fragments of each other. The experiments were not limited to them alone. Alistair tested his doctrine on others before refining it for his sons. A maid was taken from her bed and cut into. Her blood poured into a chalice and forced into the mouth of a houseboy. She convulsed on the floor, her life draining in fits, while the boy collapsed choking, his body rejecting what was never meant to be swallowed. Both died before dawn. Alistair recorded this as evidence of weakness, not failure, writing that noble blood alone possessed the strength to endure the mirror. Their deaths were not mourned. They were erased from the manor as though they had never existed. As the rituals repeated, the cellar filled with the smell of iron and smoke, with chalices stained dark despite constant polishing. Candles burned low, dripping wax like pale fingers down the stone walls. The twins moved through this world as prisoners of their father's vision, too weak to resist, too broken to hope. They no longer dreamed of gardens or laughter. Their world was narrowed to the edge of the knife, the tilt of the chalice, the endless cycle of bleeding and drinking. Each ceremony was another nail sealing the coffin of their childhood. Alistair, meanwhile, grew serene. He no longer paced the manor with restless energy. He spoke softly at meals, bowed with piety in church, and entertained guests with a gentleness that convinced them of his noble virtue. They saw a father who had lost children to illness and bore his grief with dignity. None suspected that below their feet in candlelit chambers he was crafting his doctrine in blood. To Alistair, this deception was not hypocrisy but harmony. He believed he embodied both the noble mask and the hidden truth, just as his sons embodied both giver and taker. The mirror of blood left scars deeper than flesh. The twins began to lose memory of who they had been, their minds unraveling under the weight of pain and confusion. Sometimes one would scream at the other, insisting he had stolen his soul. Other times they clung to each other, desperate for a bond their father had poisoned. They were trapped in a ritual that made them both victim and weapon, reflections not of life but of suffering. And in the shadows, Lord Alistair wrote with calm conviction that the rule of one was closer than ever, that soon the line would be perfected, and that all weakness would be consumed. By the twins' 13th year, Lord Alistair Finch had grown convinced that blood alone could not complete the work. He had drained, he had starved, he had divided voices until love turned to suspicion. Yet something in their eyes still clung to life. There remained, he believed, a residue of self that resisted his doctrine, a stubborn echo that would not die. It was this conviction that led him to build the Chamber of Stillness, a coffin-like cell of polished wood sealed tight with wax-soaked cloth, designed not to restrain the body but to smother the mind. He described it in his journal as stilling the excess soul, the final refinement before one heir could emerge. The chamber was narrow, built so that the boy placed inside could not stretch his arms or shift without scraping his skin against the wood. Every seam was sealed with layers of wax, thick enough to block sound and scent, leaving nothing but the pulse of breath against stale air. Once closed, no light remained. No sound penetrated, not even the muffled footsteps of his father outside. Time itself dissolved. Inside, the twin could not tell whether he had been sealed for hours or days. His own heartbeat became deafening, his breathing ragged as air thinned, each moment turning into a struggle against the invisible weight pressing against him. Alistair timed the confinements with the precision of a scholar. He measured how long it took before the boy scratched at the walls. How many hours passed before screams became whispers and when whispers turned to silence. When he opened the chamber, the child was no longer the same. His body shivered uncontrollably, his eyes darting as though the shadows of the coffin had followed him out. He whispered to corners of the cellar as if unseen figures answered him, his words disjointed fragments of dreams and hallucinations. Alistair watched with fascination, writing that the soul had been stripped of noise, reduced to its purest form. The experiments did not stop with the twins. Servants accused of trivial disobedience were subjected to shorter confinements. A chambermaid who dropped a silver plate was sealed inside for a single night. When released, her hair had turned streaks of gray, her mind broken, her voice lost to muttering. She threw herself from an upper window days later, her body found twisted in the manor gardens. Alistair recorded the death not with sorrow but as evidence, proof that silence was stronger than the blade. He wrote that stillness could unravel even the strongest will, and that for a child, the effect was near divine. The chosen twin suffered longest. Hours stretched into days within the coffin, his small frame collapsing under hunger, thirst, and fear. The waxed walls pressed in like flesh, sealing him into a tomb while he was still alive. He hallucinated figures who whispered promises, shadows that told him his brother had already died, that his own soul was dissolving into the wood itself. By the time the chamber was unsealed, he trembled as if he no longer knew the difference between life and death. His father studied him like a prized specimen, noting with delight that the boy no longer looked at the world with a child's eyes, but with the wide, vacant stare of someone who had touched another realm. The other twin, though spared direct confinement, did not escape the toll. He was forced to watch his brother emerge from the chamber each time, pale and broken, clutching at invisible figures, whispering names that did not exist. The sight filled him with dread, for he knew his turn would come. He lived each day in terror of the coffin, sleeping poorly, his dreams haunted by the sound of wood closing shut. He began to crumble even without entering, his mind unraveling under the weight of anticipation. Alistair recorded this too, writing that fear of stillness was as powerful as stillness itself, that the soul could be weakened by waiting as surely as by confinement. The chamber became more than a tool. It became a weapon. Alistair realized he could break anyone in his household with it. Silence replaced the whip. Darkness replaced chains. He no longer needed to spill blood to inspire obedience. The coffin's presence alone became enough. Servants lowered their eyes, children in the village were warned never to displease the Finch family, and Lady Margaret herself withdrew into quiet despair, speaking less each year, as though her voice too had been sealed away in wax. For the twins, the chamber of stillness marked the end of innocence. They were no longer children in the eyes of their father, but vessels stripped of their own identities, remade into living experiments. Their bond, once shattered by echoes and blood, was now buried beneath layers of silence so deep that even in each other's presence they struggled to speak. Alistair looked upon their trembling bodies and hollow gazes with satisfaction. He wrote that the rule of one was almost ready to be fulfilled, that only one soul remained to be chosen. In his doctrine, the coffin was not a prison but a baptism, and he believed he had perfected the tool that would decide the rightful heir. But in truth, the coffin had not merely divided them. It had hollowed them, carving out their voices, their dreams, their very sense of reality. The chamber did not still excess. It erased humanity. And still Alistair looked upon the wreckage with calm conviction, already planning the next ritual that would carry them deeper into the dark. By their 14th year, the Finch twins were no longer seen as sons, but as raw material for their father's doctrine. Years of division, silence, starvation, and blood had stripped them of childhood, yet Alistair believed that one final revelation remained. He became obsessed with the notion that truth could only be found in extremes, that pain itself was a language written into the flesh. From the whispers of physicians in London's asylums and from cruel tales carried from Bedlam, he heard of treatments where the body was subjected to fire and ice to purge madness. To Alistair, these were not punishments but confirmations of what he already believed, that only by walking both edges of suffering could the true air be revealed. He called it the ritual of exchange. In the cellar chambers he prepared 2 basins, one filled with water heated to near boiling, the other packed with ice carved from winter blocks stored in the manor's larder. Candles lined the walls, their flames bending and shivering, reflecting against the surface of the liquid as though the elements themselves were alive. The twins were brought in, trembling from anticipation, their thin bodies scarred from past rituals, their eyes vacant yet restless. They were stripped bare and placed on opposite sides of the chamber, each before a basin. The air hung heavy, thick with steam from one bowl and frost from the other, a suffocating contrast that made every breath feel unnatural. Alistair began the ritual with steady hands as though performing holy sacrament. One boy was seized and held still as water near boiling was poured over his chest, running slowly down his ribs, blistering his skin with each stream. He screamed, his back arching, but Alistair measured the flow with calm calculation, not allowing it to scald too quickly, preferring instead the cruel pace of slow destruction. Then the other twin was thrust into the basin of ice water, his body convulsing from the shock, his teeth clattering as breath left him in gasps. Alistair alternated between them, heat and cold, fire and frost, each boy forced to endure opposite ends of torment, their cries rising together into a grotesque harmony. The ritual was never swift. Hours passed as the cycle repeated, one boy lifted gasping from freezing water only to be pressed down again until his lips turned blue, while the other whimpered as skin peeled in raw patches where blisters burst under new streams of heat. Alistair timed each stage by sandglass, turning it with calm precision, writing notes even as their bodies writhed. To him the purpose was clear. If they could endure one another's pain in exchange, then their wills would fuse and the weak soul would collapse, leaving the stronger purified. He saw the ritual not as cruelty but as correction, the careful refining of lineage through fire and ice. The cellar itself became a witness to this madness. Steam and frost mixed in the air until droplets ran down the walls like sweat, and the floor was slick with water, both scalding and freezing. Servants were forced to carry buckets, their faces blank with fear, knowing that any hesitation could see them dragged into the basins themselves. One stable boy who refused to hold the struggling twin down was forced into the boiling basin as punishment. He lasted less than a minute before collapsing unconscious, his body blistered beyond recognition. He died before sunrise, and his corpse was disposed of with the same detachment as the others who had perished for Alistair's doctrine. For the twins, the ritual of exchange was more than physical torment. It was the death of whatever remained of their brotherhood. As children, they had once clung to each other for comfort. but now each came to see the other as the reason for his pain. One carried the scars of fire, the other the numbness of ice, and both looked upon each other with resentment, as though their suffering had been stolen and divided unfairly. They no longer spoke in whispers of comfort, but in broken curses, their minds poisoned by the belief that the other was the reason they had been chosen to endure. Alistair watched this hatred grow with satisfaction, writing that division was finally nearing its end, that the mirror was cracking and soon only one reflection would remain. Yet the toll was visible even to him. After each ritual, the boys collapsed, too weak to stand, their bodies trembling uncontrollably, their skin raw and their lungs wheezing. At times they did not wake for hours, lying pale as corpses on the cellar floor, and even Alistair felt a flicker of unease that his experiment might extinguish them both. Still, he justified each collapse as part of the necessary trial, convinced that survival itself was proof of worth. When they awoke screaming from fevered dreams, clawing at their own skin as though fire and ice lingered there, he saw not trauma but transformation. The ritual of exchange scarred them permanently. One twin carried burns across his chest and arms, skin puckered and warped. The other shivered constantly, unable to feel warmth even in summer, his veins sluggish as though ice remained inside him. They were no longer boys, but broken vessels, fragments of humanity kept alive for their father's doctrine. And yet to Alistair this suffering was sacred, the culmination of years of silence, hunger, and blood. He wrote in his journal that the rule of one was near its completion, that the twins had been forged by extremes, and that soon the rightful heir would emerge purified by pain. In his mind, he had not destroyed them, he had sanctified them. But to anyone else, had they been allowed to see, it was clear that the Finch line had already perished in those chambers, consumed not by plague or famine, but by a father's belief that cruelty could be mistaken for destiny. By their 16th year, the Finch twins were no longer equals. Years of ritual and cruelty had brought Alistair's doctrine to its inevitable conclusion. Only one remained alive, though to call it survival would be a cruel distortion. The boy was a fractured shadow, his body scarred by burns, his veins damaged from forced exchanges of blood, his eyes dulled by years in the coffin of stillness. He walked stiffly, his movements unnatural, as though every step required the memory of command. To those who saw him at rare family gatherings, he was introduced as the sole Finch heir, a youth of noble stock burdened by delicate health. Yet beneath the veneer of dignity was a ruin that no mask could disguise. The other twin had not simply died. Alistair had refused to allow death to be so ordinary. The boy's body, mutilated by years of ritual, was hidden beneath the manor chapel. Alistair preserved parts of him in jars of spirits, pale fragments floating in cloudy liquid like relics of a saint. His bones were partially articulated and sealed away, kept not as memory but as evidence of the doctrine fulfilled. In his ledger, Alistair wrote that the weaker essence had been stilled and consumed, that his death had sanctified the other's life. He did not bury his son as a father would. He stored him as a scholar stores a specimen, a reminder that cruelty disguised as destiny had become his greatest triumph. Guests who attended the rare dinners at Finch Manor could not help but notice the heir's vacant eyes. He sat at the table dressed in fine coats, but he rarely spoke, his hands trembling as he lifted his glass. Sometimes his head twitched suddenly, his gaze fixed on a corner of the room as if expecting someone unseen. The servants whispered that he spoke in the night to shadows, calling a brother who no longer answered. At gatherings, when questioned of his health, Alistair would smile with noble calm, dismissing curiosity with claims of fragile constitution, as if illness explained the broken figure seated beside him. None dared challenge him for fear of noble retaliation, and so the truth remained unspoken, covered by the heavy veil of silence that had always protected the Finch name. Rumors spread nonetheless, moving through the villages beyond the manor walls. Some said the boy had returned from death itself, that what sat at the Finch table was not heir but revenant. Others whispered that he was not the rightful son at all, but a changeling, that the true heir had been hidden away in disgrace. The most chilling tales spoke of cries heard beneath the chapel at night, muffled sobs and scratching against stone, as if the dead twin's spirit sought to claw its way back into the world. Those who repeated such stories too loudly often found themselves ruined, their families stripped of tenancy, their voices silenced by the weight of Alistair's authority. The surviving boy carried the toll of it all in silence. He could not escape the rituals that had shaped him. His body remembered every torment, and his mind had become a haunted echo. He no longer dreamed of gardens or childhood, for those memories had been burned away in fire and drowned in ice. Instead, he dreamed of coffins, of blood poured into silver chalices, of a brother's screams distorted through pipes. He lived as though half his soul had been stolen, which in truth it had, consumed by the doctrine of his father. To look upon him was to see a life sustained not by will but by cruelty, a living reminder that sometimes survival is its own form of death. Alistair, however, looked upon his heir with satisfaction. To him, the boy's frailty was not failure but refinement, proof that the rule of one had been achieved. He paraded him not with pride, but with the quiet calm of a man presenting evidence. The boy's stiffness, his silence, his unnatural vacancy, these were to Alistair signs of purity. The excess burned away, the bloodline distilled to its final form. What others saw as brokenness, he saw as perfection. The manor itself seemed to breathe with this silence. The chapel, built as a place of worship, had become a crypt for the mutilated twin. The dining halls, once alive with laughter, were hushed spaces where even servants feared to speak too loudly. Guests attended because to decline was dangerous, but they left uneasy, their minds disturbed by the unnatural heir who seemed less alive than preserved. Behind every polite nod and hushed toast was the weight of dread, the knowledge that something inside Finch Manor had gone deeply, irreparably wrong. The truth was never spoken openly, but it lingered in every whispered rumor, every avoided glance, every silent prayer muttered when passing the manor gates. The Finch family name remained unbroken in public, but inside its walls the line had already perished. What remained was a shell paraded before the world, a mask of survival concealing the bones and jars hidden beneath the chapel. And in Alistair's mind, this silence was victory, proof that the world could be made to accept even the most broken heir, so long as fear guarded the truth. Decades passed, and Finch Manor outlived its master. Lord Alistair Finch had died with the calm certainty of a man convinced his doctrine had been fulfilled, and the sole surviving son, broken and silent, inherited the estate but left no heirs of his own. He lived as a recluse, haunting the halls his father had turned into laboratories of suffering until finally he too withered into silence. When the doors of Finch Manor were closed for the last time, no one mourned. The house sat on its hill like a mausoleum, its windows blind, its gates chained. Time and weather did what no human hand had dared. They crept into its walls, rotting wood, cracking stone, until at last villagers, bold in the absence of a noble line to punish them, crossed its threshold to see what secrets had been buried inside. What they found turned rumor into proof and whispers into screams. Behind the heavy doors of the cellar, they uncovered chambers sealed by rusted locks. Inside, the air was thick with the stink of mold and iron, and scattered across the damp stones were chalices blackened with old blood, their silver eaten with tarnish, their rims crusted with what had once been life. Wooden boxes padded with wax-soaked cloth stood in corners, coffin-like, their interiors clawed with frantic scratches that told of those who had been sealed alive within. Against one wall stood glass jars clouded with age, each holding fragments of flesh and organ floating pale and distorted in cloudy spirits. It was here that the truth of the mutilated twin became undeniable. Ribs, hands, and a jawbone pieced crudely together as though the boy had been reduced to an exhibit rather than a child. The villagers recoiled, yet curiosity forced them deeper. In a desk drawer they found the calfskin journals of Lord Alistair Finch, volumes bound in neat leather, the pages filled with careful script that detailed his methods with chilling precision. Each entry described the twins' suffering as though it were an experiment in nature. Starvation measured against overfeeding, blood poured from one into the other, silence pressed upon the mind until voices broke. He wrote of stillness as though it were a cure, of division as though it were science, and of his sons as though they were specimens to be dissected. The writing carried no remorse, no hesitation, only the calm confidence of a man convinced his cruelty had been divine necessity. The discovery spread quickly. Villagers whispered of nailed coffins and silver chalices filled with blood, of preserved organs hidden like relics, of journals that read like scripture written by a madman. Some believed the house itself had absorbed the screams, that the walls breathed with the agony of those who had died within. Others argued that no one could invent such horrors, that the evidence was too exact, too methodical to be fantasy. The unease grew into outrage, and though the manor was abandoned, its legacy refused to fade. Reformers traveling through Norfolk carried the tale to London, where early debates on cruelty to children had already begun to surface. The Finch journals became a secret text passed among campaigners, proof that even noble houses could conceal atrocities behind their gilded walls. Lawmakers who once dismissed whispers of cruelty as exaggeration now faced the reality of methodical torment carried out under the guise of nobility. The Finch case was cited in hushed meetings as evidence that children must be protected not only from poverty, but from the hidden madness of those who claim to own them. By the time the Victorian era arrived with its Child Protection Acts and its growing outrage at cruelty in asylums and factories, the horrors of Finch Manor stood in the background as one of many shadows that pushed society toward reform. The house itself became known as the House of Memorials, not for any monument built within it, but because every wall carried the memory of what had been done there. Yet the legacy was not only legal. The psychological toll of what was uncovered rippled through the community for years. Families who had once served the Finches carried shame in their bloodlines, afraid to admit their ancestors had brought water to the torture chambers or polished the chalices. Children were warned never to wander near the manor, told that the ghost of the mutilated twin still moved beneath the chapel floor, searching for his lost voice. The house became a site of pilgrimage for the curious and the fearful alike. Its ruins left untouched, as if to disturb them would awaken what had been bound there. Through all of it, the journals of Alistair Finch remained the most damning artifact. Their calm, precise tone revealed a truth more horrifying than the relics themselves, that the greatest cruelties had not been born of frenzy but of method, not of chaos but of order. Each word proved that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it writes in neat lines, it weighs and measures, it cloaks itself in reason until the unthinkable appears justified. This realization unsettled even those hardened by reform, for it suggested that the Finch horrors were not an aberration, but a reflection of what men might do when convinced their cause is righteous. And so Finch Manor, left to rot on its hill, became more than a ruin. It became a mirror of society's own silence, a reminder that respectability can hide cruelty, that noble walls can mask torture, and that evil thrives most easily where no one dares to look. The villagers did not cleanse the house. They left it standing as a warning, a silent memorial to the children who had been erased from the world yet never truly forgotten. When the last door of Finch Manor finally closed, the silence that fell across its grounds was not new but ancient. Silence had been the tool, the weapon, and the sanctuary of Lord Alistair Finch, the fabric in which he wrapped his cruelties until no one dared to look too closely. It was silence that had allowed his sons to vanish after age 8 without question. Silence that permitted the rituals of blood and hunger and stillness to continue in chambers beneath the earth. And it was silence that lingered long after the house stood empty, for evil does not always disappear when its hand grows cold. Often it remains in echoes, preserved in whispers, fed by the refusal to confront what was once accepted as normal. The Finch twins had been erased not by illness, as polite society believed, but by methodical suffering carried out in the name of doctrine. They had been broken piece by piece, voices divided, bodies starved and drowned, blood drained and consumed. One confined to coffins of silence, the other mutilated until nothing human remained. Yet none of these horrors had been spoken of at court. No noble raised their voice, no priest condemned, no servant testified. The boys were never acknowledged after childhood because acknowledgement would have meant exposure, and exposure would have meant shame for all who had bowed to Lord Finch. Better, it seemed, to bury them under the polite fiction of fever, to allow the silence to protect reputation while it consumed lives. This is how evil thrives, not in the sudden outbursts of madness that shock and fade, but in the patient ritual of control carried out behind respectable walls. Alistair Finch did not look like a monster to those who dined at his table. He prayed with sincerity in the chapel, gave alms to the poor, and offered wise counsel to neighbors. His face was calm, his speech measured, his posture noble. No one who saw him in daylight imagined that at night he lit candles over silver chalices filled with the blood of his children. The mask of dignity is often the most dangerous disguise because it allows cruelty to exist not in secret but in plain sight, dismissed because no one wishes to believe it could be true. Decades later, when the journals were uncovered and the truth laid bare, reformers would point to Finch Manor as proof that silence was not harmless but complicit. The law began to bend slowly, acknowledging that children were not merely possessions, but lives that could be destroyed if left unprotected. Whispers of the Finch horrors circulated in the corridors of Parliament, shaping the conscience of those who later argued for child protection acts. But by then it was too late for the twins whose suffering had already been transmuted into evidence, their lives reduced to footnotes in debates about cruelty. They had been victims of more than their father. They were victims of a society that chose silence over confrontation. The legacy of the Finch twins is not only their pain but the lesson it reveals. That evil does not need chaos to flourish. It needs silence. It needs neighbors who choose not to question, servants who bow their heads, guests who accept a nobleman's explanation without pressing further. It needs the comfort of reputation to mask the stench of cruelty, and the fear of consequence to keep tongues still. In this way, Alistair's greatest weapon was never the coffin or the chalice. It was the silence of those who might have spoken but did not. The story of the Finches is not only a relic of the 18th century, it is a warning. For cruelty disguised as necessity has reappeared in every age. In asylums where patients were broken in the name of treatment, in factories where children were consumed by machines under the excuse of progress, in schools and churches where silence allowed generations of abuse to thrive. Each time society is told not to ask questions, not to break the silence, the rule of one reappears under new names, new masks, new doctrines. In the end, the Finch twins became shadows, their names unspoken, their faces lost, their lives reduced to proof of a father's obsession. They were children sacrificed not only to his doctrine but to the silence of a community that chose respectability over truth. Their story echoes still because silence never truly dies. It lingers in institutions, in families, in any place where cruelty is allowed to wear the mask of normalcy. And so the question remains, one that cannot be left to history alone. Could such evil return under the cover of respectability? Could another Finch Manor rise behind closed doors, hidden in rituals of control while the world looks away? The silence that protected Lord Alistair still exists wherever fear and pride outweigh truth. The only choice is whether we allow it to speak again or whether we break it before it swallows another voice, another child, another generation. Word count, 800. Would you like me to now compile the entire 10-chapter manuscript, 8,000 words total, into a seamless full documentary script for narration, with smooth transitions between each chapter? ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.